Think for a moment. Imagine that the most sacred temple ever known was never built with hands, never carved from stone, never crowned with gold, and never confined to a single place on earth. Imagine that this temple was designed to be invisible to the eyes, yet unmistakable to those who awaken. Imagine that it was never meant to be entered by crowds, priests, or kings, but by the individual soul in silence. This idea is not poetic exaggeration. It is one of the most radical and dangerous teachings attributed to Jesus, and it is the foundation of what can be called the inner temple. For centuries, the figure of Jesus has been presented primarily as a savior to be worshipped, a sacrifice to be accepted, or a judge to be feared. But beneath this surface interpretation exists a far older and more unsettling message. Jesus did not merely speak about God, he spoke from a state of union with the divine. He did not ask people to wait for salvation after death. He spoke of awakening here and now. And the final revelation of this journey is the most powerful of all, because it does not offer comfort, it offers responsibility. It does not give answers, it reorients perception. And when understood, it changes forever how one understands faith, self, and reality. This message resonates deeply with those who feel that truth is not new, but ancient, passed quietly from generation to generation, encoded in symbols, parables, and silences, preserved not by institutions but by consciousness itself. Hermetic philosophy, mystical Judaism, esoteric Christianity, and sacred psychology all converge here. They point to the same truth, that the divine is not distant, it is interior. And Jesus, more than any other figure in Western spiritual history, articulated this reality with precision and danger. If you are drawn to hidden wisdom, to teachings that challenge appearances and invite inner transformation, subscribe to this channel, leave a like, share this message, and comment with your reflections. What will be revealed throughout this journey has the potential to change how you understand life, death, and the universe itself. When Jesus spoke of the kingdom of God, he did not describe a future paradise or a distant heaven. He said it was within. This statement alone collapses entire systems of external authority. If the kingdom is within, then the temple must also be within. And if the temple is within, then access to the sacred does not depend on location, lineage, or permission. It depends on awareness. This idea did not emerge in isolation. Jesus lived within a symbolic and mystical world shaped by ancient Jewish traditions. In early forms of Jewish mysticism, especially those that later influenced Kabbalistic thought, the human being was understood as a microcosm of the cosmos. The temple in Jerusalem was not merely a building. It was a reflection of a deeper inner structure, a map of consciousness. The Holy of Holies symbolized the deepest point of the soul, accessible only through purification and reverence. Jesus repeatedly redirected attention away from external rituals and toward inner transformation. When questioned about the law, he spoke of intention. When questioned about purity, he spoke of the heart. When questioned about authority, he spoke of truth. This inward movement was not metaphorical, it was experiential. To enter the inner temple meant to undergo a profound shift in perception, where the ego dissolves and a deeper identity emerges. Scholars such as Elaine Pagels and Marvin Meyer have shown that early Christian communities preserved sayings of Jesus that emphasized direct knowledge of the divine. Texts like the Gospel of Thomas present a Jesus who speaks not of belief, but of recognition. He speaks of light already present within the individual. These teachings were not lost accidentally. They were marginalized because they made external control unnecessary. A person who discovers the inner temple does not require intermediaries. One of the most striking moments in the life of Jesus is the cleansing of the temple. On the surface, it appears as an act of moral outrage against corruption, but on a deeper level, it functions as a symbolic teaching. The temple overtaken by commerce represents the inner world dominated by fear, desire, and distraction. To cleanse the temple is to reclaim inner sovereignty. It is to remove false values from the center of one's being. Centuries later, Carl Jung would describe a similar process through the concept of individuation. He understood that spiritual awakening involves confronting the shadow, integrating the unconscious, and allowing the self to emerge as the organizing center of the psyche. This psychological insight mirrors the spiritual message of Jesus. The inner temple must be cleared so that the divine presence may be consciously realized. This is why the message of Jesus was threatening, not because it challenged morality, but because it dissolved dependency. An awakened individual cannot be ruled through fear. A person who recognizes the divine within does not need constant external validation. Such a person becomes free, inwardly anchored, and spiritually sovereign. Ask yourself sincerely, if the sacred is within you, why have you been taught to search for it elsewhere? If the temple is internal, what has been placed upon its altar? Fear, guilt, obedience, or awareness and truth? And if Jesus truly meant what he said, what does it mean for your own responsibility in the journey of awakening? This is only the opening. Beneath these ideas lies a deeper structure, a hidden architecture of consciousness that connects Jesus to ancient mystery traditions and to a final revelation that explains why the inner temple is not symbolic, but functional, a living reality that can be entered, a truth that transforms not belief, but being itself. Think carefully about what has already been revealed. If the inner temple is real, if it is not poetry or metaphor but a living structure of consciousness, then a question naturally arises. How does one enter it? And why was this knowledge spoken in symbols, parables, and silences rather than explained openly? To understand this, we must move deeper into the hidden dimension of Jesus' teachings, where language becomes layered and truth is revealed only to those prepared to see. Jesus consistently spoke in parables, not to confuse, but to filter. He himself stated that some would hear without understanding and see without perceiving. This was not elitism, it was protection. Inner knowledge, when given prematurely, does not liberate, it destabilizes. The inner temple cannot be entered through information alone. It requires transformation. This is why Jesus spoke to the inner state of the listener rather than to their intellect. In ancient mystery traditions, from Egypt to Greece, initiation followed the same pattern. The candidate was not taught doctrines. They were guided through inner death and rebirth. Jesus' language mirrors this initiatory structure. When he speaks of being born again, he is not speaking of belief. He is speaking of a radical reorientation of identity. The old self, anchored in fear and social conditioning, must dissolve so that a deeper consciousness may emerge. This is where Hermetic wisdom converges with the teachings of Jesus. The Hermetic principle of correspondence states that what is above is like what is below, and what is within reflects what is without. The inner temple is the point of correspondence between the human and the divine. It is the axis where heaven and earth meet, not in the sky, but in awareness itself. Early Christian mystics understood this clearly. Origen of Alexandria, one of the most influential theologians of the early centuries, spoke of Scripture as having multiple layers, literal, moral, and spiritual. The spiritual meaning, he argued, was accessible only through inner transformation. The same applies to the words of Jesus. Without inner work, they remain moral teachings. With inner awakening, they become keys. Consider the phrase, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Taken literally, it was misunderstood. Taken inwardly, it reveals a profound initiatory truth. The destruction of the false temple, the egoic identity built on fear and separation, is necessary for the true temple to arise. The 3 days symbolize a period of inner darkness, disorientation, and gestation, a symbolic descent into the unconscious. Only after this inner death does resurrection occur, not as a physical event, but as a shift in being. This pattern appears repeatedly in Jesus' life and teachings. Withdrawal into the desert, nights spent in prayer, silence before accusation. These are not incidental details. They point to the inner work required to stabilize consciousness in the inner temple. Solitude is not loneliness in this context. It is purification. Silence is not emptiness. It is alignment. Modern psychology has begun to rediscover what these ancient teachings already knew. Abraham Maslow spoke of peak experiences. William James studied mystical states of consciousness. Carl Jung identified the self as the central archetype of wholeness, experienced when the psyche becomes integrated. These thinkers did not invent new truths. They translated ancient inner realities into modern language. The inner temple is accessed through awareness, sincerity, and inner honesty. This is why Jesus emphasized humility, not as submission, but as openness. Pride closes the temple. Certainty seals its doors. Only those willing to question their own assumptions can cross its threshold. This also explains why institutional religion often feels empty to seekers. Ritual without inner engagement becomes repetition. Doctrine without experience becomes control. Jesus did not come to build institutions. He came to awaken individuals. The church, in its original meaning, was not a building. It was an assembly of awakened consciousness. Ask yourself now, when you pray, where is your attention? When you seek meaning, do you look outward for answers or inward for resonance? And if the inner temple requires inner death before rebirth, what part of your identity resists letting go? What comes next is even more unsettling, because entering the inner temple is not the final step. It is the beginning of responsibility. Jesus did not reveal inner divinity so that humans could escape the world, but so that they could transform how they live within it. The next stage reveals why awakening is inseparable from ethical power, and why the inner temple, once entered, demands alignment between inner truth and outer action. Once the inner temple is entered, something irreversible occurs. The individual can no longer live as before. This is the aspect of Jesus' teaching that is rarely emphasized because it removes the comfort of passive spirituality. Awakening is not an escape, it is a summons. To recognize the divine within is to accept responsibility for how one thinks, speaks, and acts in the world. This is why Jesus consistently linked inner realization with outer integrity. Many people seek spiritual knowledge for reassurance, peace, or a sense of belonging. But the path Jesus pointed toward offers none of these guarantees. Instead, it offers truth, and truth reorganizes life from the inside out. Once the inner temple is awakened, hypocrisy becomes impossible. One can no longer hide behind roles, masks, or inherited beliefs. The inner and outer worlds must align, or suffering intensifies. This is why Jesus spoke so sharply against appearances. He criticized those who prayed loudly in public but were inwardly empty. He challenged religious leaders who followed external law but neglected inner justice and compassion. His message was not anti-tradition, it was anti-division. A divided person, outwardly righteous and inwardly fragmented, cannot sustain the inner temple. The inner temple functions as a center of coherence. In modern terms, it is a state where consciousness, emotion, and action become integrated. This integration produces a distinct quality of presence. When Jesus spoke, people felt authority not because of his status, but because of his coherence. He spoke from alignment. His words carried weight because they emerged from lived truth. This coherence is what ancient traditions referred to as power, not power over others, but power over oneself. Hermetic texts describe this as mastery of the inner world, which naturally influences the outer world. Jesus echoed this when he spoke of faith moving mountains. This was never about supernatural spectacle. It was about the capacity of aligned consciousness to reshape reality through clarity, intention, and action. The inner temple also reveals why forgiveness is central to Jesus' teaching. Forgiveness is not moral weakness. It is psychological and spiritual liberation. Resentment fragments the inner world. Guilt corrodes the center. Forgiveness restores inner symmetry. It clears the temple. This is why Jesus connected forgiveness with freedom, not divine approval, but inner release. Scholars such as René Girard have shown how Jesus exposed the mechanics of violence, scapegoating, and collective illusion. By refusing to participate in cycles of blame and retaliation, Jesus demonstrated what it means to act from the inner temple. He did not react from wounded identity. He responded from awareness. This distinction is crucial. Reaction belongs to the fragmented self. Response arises from the integrated self. This is also why fear plays such a central role in spiritual stagnation. Fear externalizes authority. Fear seeks protection in systems, leaders, and rigid beliefs. The inner temple dissolves fear by grounding identity in something deeper than circumstance. Jesus repeatedly said, "Do not be afraid," not as comfort, but as instruction. Fear clouds perception. Clarity restores sight. At this stage, a critical realization emerges. The inner temple is not private. It is intimate but not isolated. Once awakened, it naturally radiates outward through action. Compassion becomes instinctive, not forced. Ethics become organic, not imposed. This is what Jesus meant by being the light of the world. Light does not argue, it illuminates. Ask yourself now, If your inner world were fully aligned, what would change in how you treat others? What patterns would dissolve? What truths would you no longer avoid? And if awakening demands consistency, not perfection, where does your life resist alignment? What remains to be revealed is the most profound and least discussed dimension of Jesus' teaching. The reason the inner temple was kept hidden, the reason this knowledge was dangerous, and the reason the final realization does not elevate the ego, but dissolves it entirely. This final truth explains why Jesus said that those who seek to save their life will lose it, and those who lose it will find it. At the deepest level of Jesus' teaching lies a truth so transformative that it could never be safely reduced to doctrine without losing its power. This is why the inner temple was never described in systematic language, never formalized into rituals that could be mechanically repeated. The final realization Jesus pointed toward does not elevate the personality, does not crown the ego with spiritual titles, and does not grant superiority. It does the opposite. It dissolves the false center that humanity mistakes for the self. When Jesus said that whoever seeks to save their life will lose it, and whoever loses their life will find it, he was not glorifying suffering for its own sake, nor encouraging blind sacrifice. He was articulating one of the most profound psychological and spiritual truths ever spoken. The identity constructed from fear, memory, social conditioning, trauma, and desire cannot coexist with awakened consciousness. The inner temple cannot be occupied by a fragmented self. Something must be released. This release is not destruction but unveiling. The ego is not evil. It is incomplete. It is a survival structure that mistakes itself for the whole. Jesus' teaching does not condemn the ego, but it refuses to enthrone it. To enter the deepest chamber of the inner temple, the individual must relinquish the illusion of separateness. This is the narrow gate Jesus spoke of. Narrow not because it excludes, but because very little can pass through it. The inner temple is not accessed through accumulation, not through collecting beliefs, spiritual practices, moral achievements, or intellectual certainty. It is accessed through subtraction. Every attachment to image, reputation, control, and rigid identity becomes a veil. Every insistence on being right, special, or chosen reinforces the walls of the false temple. This is why Jesus praised simplicity, humility, and poverty of spirit. These were not moral ideals meant to be imitated outwardly. They were descriptions of an inner state free from excess identity. Mystical traditions across cultures confirm this same architecture of awakening. In Jewish mysticism, particularly in later Kabbalistic expressions, the dissolution of egoic selfhood precedes devakut, the cleaving to divine presence. In Christian mysticism, Meister Eckhart spoke of the necessity of letting go even of concepts of God, so that the divine could be experienced as the ground of being rather than an object. In Eastern traditions, this realization appears as non-dual awareness, where the boundary between self and world collapses. Different languages, different symbols, the same inner truth. Jesus did not merely teach this realization, he embodied it. His authority did not come from position, lineage, or institutional backing. It came from absence of false identity. He spoke and acted from a place unanchored to fear. This is why his presence unsettled both political and religious authorities. A person who no longer depends on approval cannot be controlled. A consciousness rooted in truth cannot be intimidated. This realization also reframes the meaning of the crucifixion. Beyond theology, beyond history, it functions as a symbolic culmination of the inner path, the complete surrender of egoic defense, the refusal to preserve an identity built on fear, the trust in a deeper order that transcends survival instinct. Resurrection, in this inner sense, is not the return of the old self. It is the emergence of a new mode of being, no longer governed by the same psychological laws. Joseph Campbell recognized this pattern as the universal hero's journey. Descent into darkness, symbolic death, and return transformed. But Jesus' teaching goes even further. The return is not to personal power, but to service, not to dominance, but to presence, not to separation, but to radical intimacy with life itself. The awakened individual does not withdraw from the world. They inhabit it differently. This is the true meaning of salvation in Jesus' message. Not rescue from existence, but liberation within it. Not escape from responsibility, but clarity about it. The inner temple, once fully realized, becomes a point of stillness in a fragmented world. It does not make life easier, it makes life truthful. Illusion can no longer be comfortably maintained. At this level, prayer transforms completely. It is no longer a request directed outward. It becomes alignment. A tuning of consciousness to reality as it is. Silence becomes more eloquent than language. Action becomes precise because it no longer arises from inner conflict. This is what Jesus meant when he spoke of doing the will of the Father, not obedience to an external authority, but coherence with the deepest intelligence of being. Ethics also change at this stage. Morality is no longer imposed from outside. Compassion arises naturally because separation has dissolved. Forgiveness becomes inevitable because there is no longer a rigid self to defend. Love ceases to be a commandment and becomes a consequence. This is why Jesus could summarize all law into love. Not sentimental love, but ontological unity. The danger of this realization has always been clear. A world structured around fear, consumption, and hierarchy cannot easily coexist with individuals who no longer derive identity from these structures. Such individuals are inwardly free. They do not require constant validation. They cannot be motivated primarily through fear or reward. This is why the inner temple was obscured, delayed, and externalized throughout history. Not because it was false, but because it was destabilizing to systems built on unconsciousness. Now, the final question is not theological, it is existential. If everything Jesus pointed toward is real, if the temple is truly within, and if awakening requires the surrender of the false self, then what are you still protecting? What identity feels too valuable to release? What fear disguises itself as certainty? The teaching of Jesus does not culminate in belief. It culminates in awareness. The inner temple is not a place you visit. It is a state you become. And once this truth is seen, it cannot be unseen. The door was never locked. It was only hidden behind the idea of who you thought you were. Thanks for looking.